Welcome to English as a Second Language podcast number 9. Welcome to another edition of English as a Second Language podcast, brought to you by www.eslpod.com. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff McQuillan, Senior Researcher at the Center for Educational Development here in Los Angeles, California. ESL Podcast is especially made for you, those who are trying to improve their English listening and speaking. If this is the first time listening to this podcast, I recommend that you go to our website, www.eslpod.com, to read more about how best to use this podcast to improve your English. There are two parts to every ESL podcast. First, we have a conversation or interview with a native speaker. Second, we have an explanation of vocabulary and expressions used during the first part of the podcast. Today I'm going to talk about asking for a favor or asking for something in a perhaps somewhat difficult situation. How do we ask people formally and politely for things? I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience with this, and then as usual, we will go back and talk about some of the specific expressions and vocabulary. Let's get started. There have been several times in my work where I had to ask permission or for a favor that was somewhat difficult. And so I wanted to ask very nicely, very politely. One time I went into my boss's office and asked if I could have some vacation time near one of the big holidays. So I went to her and I said, "Excuse me, Ms. Chang, may I ask you a question?" And she said, "Sure, go ahead." "Well," I said, "I was wondering if it would be okay for me to take a few days off next week." She then asked me, "Could you tell me why you need to take a day off so near a holiday?" I said, "Well, I was hoping that I could combine my vacation with the holiday to have more time." She said, "I'm sorry, but I can't give you any vacation time next week." Another time I went into my manager's office to ask him for a raise. I wanted more money. Now, I was very nervous, but I thought if I asked politely enough, he might just say yes. So I went to him and I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Hildiger, I wonder if I could ask you a question." "Of course," he said. "Well," I said, "I was interested in what the company's policy was on pay raises. Would you mind telling me how often people get a raise in this division?" He looked at me and said, "Not very often." Well, even though I asked politely, I did not get a raise. Another time, I was working in a small office here in Santa Monica, California, and there was a girl there that I really liked. Her name was Julie. Anyway, I finally got up the nerve to ask her out to go on a date with me. So I said, "Hey, Julie, could you tell me what you're doing this weekend?" She said, "Oh, nothing much." Then I said, "Well, I was wondering whether you wanted to go to the movies. She said, "Hey, that's a great idea. I'm going to call my friend Sam and ask him." Well, I wasn't very successful in asking her out for a date. I forgot to say that I wanted her to go to the movies with me. Now let's talk about some of the difficult vocabulary in that last segment. We heard several ways of asking for things politely in a business or formal setting, as well as in an informal setting. When I was talking about asking for vacation, I came up to my boss and I said, "May I ask you a question?" The expression "may I" means you're asking for permission to do something. It's a polite way of doing it, of asking. Then I said, "I was wondering if it would be okay for me," and then etc. I went on and asked for a day off. The expression "I was wondering if" is also an indirect way of politely bringing up a topic, often a somewhat sensitive topic. My boss replied in that first segment, "Could you tell me why you need a day off?" "Could you tell me," again, is a polite way of asking for information. Could you tell me where the restroom is? Could you tell me how long my appointment will last? All of these are polite expressions. In talking about asking my boss for a raise, I used some of those same expressions. When I came into his office, I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Hildiger, I wonder if I could ask you a question." This is another way of asking for permission. "I wonder if I could use your car. I wonder if I could get a new ticket." All of these are similar in asking politely for permission. I also said in that segment, I was interested in what the company's policy was on pay raises. To say "I was interested in" is again an indirect way of trying to find out. It's the same as "I was wondering if," and so forth. "Would you mind telling me" is a similar expression to "could you" or "would you." Would you mind giving me some information? It's always usually followed by a gerund, so a verb in the ing form. Would you mind asking your friend if she's free on Saturday night? This is how we use the "would you mind." It's usually done when you think that the favor you're going to ask is something of a burden to the person. A few other expressions we used. "Could you tell me?" "Could you tell me what you're doing this weekend?" There really is no difference between "could you tell me" and "would you tell me." Sometimes we think that "would you tell me" is a little bit more formal, not quite as appropriate for a friend or a work colleague that you know well. So in this podcast, we've talked about several ways of asking for permission and asking for a favor. "May I" is always a good way to politely ask for something. "May I have your phone number?" It's somewhat formal. If it's informal, if we know someone well, we would say, "Can I get your phone number?" But to say "may I" is a little bit more formal. "I was wondering if" and "I was interested in" are both expressions that try to get information somewhat indirectly from a person. "Could you tell me?" "Would you tell me?" or would you mind telling me are all equivalent expressions. Again, would perhaps slightly more formal than could. That's going to wrap it up for today's ESL podcast. Tomorrow we'll come back and we'll talk more about asking politely, this time on a telephone. These podcasts are provided free to anyone who wants to learn English. But we at the Center for Educational Development would like to get some feedback from those of you who are out listening. We have had some emails from Japan and Taiwan thanking us for our podcast and giving us some suggestions. We'd like to hear from you. Please email us at eslpod@eslpod.com. That's eslpod@eslpod.com. Or go to our website, www.eslpod.com, and our email address is found on the bottom of the page. We'd like to know who is listening to our podcast, where are you living, and do you have some suggestions or ideas or things you'd like us to talk about in future podcasts. Thank you for your support. ESL Podcast is produced by the Center for Educational Development in Los Angeles, California. This podcast is copyright 2005.